Anger burns you first. Every time you lose your temper, you are punishing yourself for someone else's mistake. And the punishment you are giving yourself is always more severe than anything you could possibly give them. Not metaphorically, not philosophically, literally, in the most immediate, most physiological, most completely real sense available. The moment anger floods your system, you become the first and the most immediate casualty. The stress hormones that the anger releases are moving through your body, not theirs. The blood pressure elevation is happening in your cardiovascular system, not theirs. The cognitive narrowing, the specific, measurable reduction in the quality of your thinking, your judgment, your creative problem solving, your access to the nuanced reasoning that the situation most urgently requires, that is happening in your prefrontal cortex, not theirs. They may not even know you are angry. They may have moved on entirely, proceeding through their day with the specific, comfortable indifference of someone who either does not know or does not care what the anger they provoked is doing to the person it is being experienced by. And you are sitting in the physiological equivalent of a burning building. Elevated cortisol, elevated adrenaline, elevated inflammatory markers, reduced rational function, reduced emotional regulation, reduced access to the actual best quality of what you are genuinely capable of, while they go about their life completely untouched by the fire that is consuming you. This is the fundamental truth about anger that the Stoics identified with such precision and such practical urgency that Seneca spent one of his longest and most important works, De Ira, on anger, making the case in the most direct, most comprehensive, most practically applicable form he could find for the specific, concrete, daily relevant reality that anger is not what most people think it is. Most people think anger is a weapon aimed at someone else. Seneca was trying to make them understand, with the specific, urgent, genuinely caring quality of someone who had watched anger destroy people and relationships and reputations and entire lives, that it is a weapon aimed at the self. That the person who is angry is the primary victim of the anger. That the burning feeling of the anger is not a power being expressed outward, but a damage being done inward. Today, on the Stoic Mindset, we are going into the complete architecture of this truth. Not just the physiological dimension, though the physiology is real and significant and important. Every dimension. The cognitive damage, the relational cost, the character erosion, the life-narrowing consequence of a pattern of anger that, left unaddressed, gradually and invisibly constructs a smaller and smaller version of the life that was possible before the anger became the governing principle. And we are going into the complete, practical, daily applicable architecture of the alternative. The specific practices that the Stoics built and tested and refined across centuries of genuine philosophical engagement with one of the most powerful and the most destructive emotional forces available to a human being. This is the lesson that changes the relationship with anger. And that relationship is one of the most consequential relationships you have.
There was a Roman general named Gnaeus Cornelius Dolabella who served during the late Republic and who became, in the philosophical literature of his era, something of a cautionary example. Not because of his military record, which was competent, not because of his political career, which was moderately distinguished, but because of the specific, documented, completely avoidable series of catastrophic decisions that his unmanaged anger consistently produced throughout his public and private life. Dolabella was brilliant. Everyone who wrote about him agreed about this. He had the specific, strategic, genuinely exceptional intelligence that the most demanding military and political situations of his era required. He could analyze a military situation with the speed and the precision of someone who had spent decades developing the specific capacity for it. He could navigate the political landscape of the late Republic, one of the most complex, most dangerous, most constantly shifting political environments that the ancient world produced, with a facility that marked him as someone who genuinely understood how power worked. And then he would get angry. Not at the significant provocations, though he got angry at those too, at the small ones. The subordinate who questioned a decision, the ally who delayed a response to a request, the political opponent who made a remark that touched the specific, reliable, consistently findable tender spot that the anger was organized around. In these moments, which were ordinary, which were the normal, predictable, completely manageable provocations of any complex political and military career, Dolabella's anger would produce decisions that the intelligence he otherwise possessed would never have produced. He relieved a subordinate of command for questioning a tactical decision, a subordinate whose judgment about that specific decision, it turned out, was correct, and whose removal cost the military campaign significantly more than the brief embarrassment of being publicly questioned would have cost. He made a political alliance, in a moment of anger at an ally who had not moved quickly enough, with a faction whose values were incompatible with his own, and the alliance eventually contributed to the unraveling of his entire political position. Each of these decisions was made at the moment of maximum anger, and each of them, assessed in the cold, honest, post-anger quality of the person who has seen the consequence, was the inverse of what the intelligence that was otherwise available would have produced. A younger philosopher who had observed Dolabella over several years eventually wrote about him with the specific, compassionate, completely honest quality of someone trying to understand what had produced such a consistent gap between the obvious intelligence and the consistently poor decisions in the specific contexts where the anger was governing. He said, Dolabella's intelligence was not the problem. His intelligence was extraordinary. The problem was that his anger was faster than his intelligence, and in the space between the anger's arrival and the intelligence's engagement, every decision he ever regretted was made. His anger was faster than his intelligence. That sentence is the complete diagnosis of what unmanaged anger does to the person who experiences it, and everything that follows today is the specific, practical, daily applicable treatment.
The first thing to understand completely at the most foundational level is the precise mechanism through which anger produces its damage, because the understanding of the mechanism is the beginning of the capacity to govern it. Anger is not a simple emotion. It is a complex physiological, cognitive, and behavioral cascade that unfolds in a specific sequence and that at each stage of the sequence produces specific effects that are distinct from each other and that require distinct responses. The first stage is the trigger, the external event or the internal interpretation that initiates the sequence. The colleague's dismissive comment, the partner's tone that carried a specific quality, the driver's behavior that violated the traffic norm and barely avoided the accident, the news story that touched the specific, reliable, consistently findable thing that news stories about that specific topic always touch. The trigger is not yet anger. It is the specific external or internal stimulus that begins the process. The second stage is the appraisal, the specific, rapid, mostly unconscious assessment that the mind makes of what the trigger means. Is this a threat, a disrespect, a violation of something that matters, an injustice? This appraisal happens before the conscious mind has any involvement. It is produced by the amygdala, the brain's threat detection system, which processes the trigger and produces its assessment with a speed that the rational mind cannot match. And the appraisal, once made, produces the third stage. The third stage is the physiological cascade. The amygdala's assessment of threat triggers the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the system that releases cortisol and adrenaline into the bloodstream. The heart rate increases, the breathing becomes rapid and shallow, the muscles tense. The digestive system slows as resources are diverted to the systems that the fight-or-flight response prioritizes. And this is the specific consequential damage that Dolabella was experiencing. The prefrontal cortex goes partially offline, not completely offline. The prefrontal cortex does not simply stop functioning when the anger response is activated, but its function is significantly impaired, measurably, reliably, in the specific way that the anger response consistently impairs it. Because the resources that the prefrontal cortex requires to function at its highest quality are being diverted to the more primitive brain systems that the fight-or-flight response is activating. And the prefrontal cortex is the specific brain structure that produces the specific cognitive capacities that the anger situation most urgently requires. The nuanced reasoning, the long-term perspective, the social intelligence that understands the other person's position, the creative problem-solving that finds the solution that the immediate reactive response misses, the impulse control that prevents the catastrophically bad decision from being executed before the consequences have been anticipated. All of them are the products of the prefrontal cortex. All of them are impaired by the anger response. All of them were less available to Dolabella in the moment of the anger than they were in every other moment of his day.
This is the mechanism. The anger produces the state in which the capacities most needed for the wise response are the least available.
And the decision made in that state, the decision that the anger is pressuring toward, the decision that the reduced prefrontal function is producing, is almost always, in the honest post-anger assessment, the decision that the full prefrontal capacity would not have made. Understanding this mechanism is the beginning of the capacity to govern the anger, because the person who understands that the anger is producing the state of reduced capacity, who understands that the feeling of certainty and justified outrage that the anger produces is the feeling of reduced capacity rather than the feeling of heightened clarity, has access to something that the person who does not understand the mechanism does not have. The specific, practical motivation to pause, to recognize the anger state for what it is, to refuse to make the decision in the state that the anger has produced, to wait for the capacity to return. The first pillar of governing anger is the practice of the space, the specific, deliberate, daily built practice of creating and maintaining the space between the anger's arrival and the action the anger is pressuring toward. Seneca identified this as the single most important and the most immediately impactful practice available for the governance of anger. He said, and the simplicity of what he said is not an indication of its superficiality, it is an indication of its precision, that the best remedy for anger is delay. Delay, not the suppression of the anger, not the management of the anger, not the sophisticated philosophical reframing of the anger. The simple, powerful, completely practical delay. The specific, deliberate, completely real insertion of time between the anger's arrival and the action the anger is demanding. The delay does not eliminate the anger. Seneca was not making a claim about the complete neutralization of the emotional state through the passage of time. He was making a practical, mechanistic claim about what the passage of time does to the specific, physiological, cognitive quality of the anger state. The cortisol level begins to decline with time, the adrenaline begins to metabolize, the heart rate begins to normalize, and, most importantly, the prefrontal cortex begins to come back online. The nuanced reasoning becomes available again, the long-term perspective becomes accessible again, the social intelligence, the impulse control, the creative problem-solving, all of these begin to return. And what the returning capacity produces applied to the situation that the anger state was assessing is almost always a different and better quality of response than the anger state was producing. Not always a softer response. Sometimes the anger was identifying a genuine injustice that genuinely requires a strong response, but a more effective response, a more genuinely considered response, a response that the full capacity has produced rather than the impaired capacity of the anger state. The delay practice begins before the anger arrives. It is built in the ordinary moments through the specific, daily, completely real practice of catching the anger state as early as possible in its development, ideally at the trigger stage before the physiological cascade is fully underway, and inserting the pause. The specific, practiced, completely real pause that creates the space for the recovering capacity to engage with the situation before the impaired capacity has produced the irreversible action. Seneca described his personal practice with an honesty that makes his writing on anger feel immediately applicable. He said that when he felt the anger beginning, he would make a specific, deliberate commitment to himself. Nothing will be decided right now, not while this state is governing. The decision will wait. The response will wait. The action will wait. Until the capacity that the anger has impaired has had time to recover. Build the delay through the daily, specific, completely real practice of recognizing the anger state earlier and earlier as the practice develops, and committing at every stage of the recognition to the specific delay that the recovering capacity requires. Because the decision that the recovering capacity produces is always, in the honest assessment, better than the decision that the impaired capacity was producing. The second pillar is the complete, honest, Stoic-grounded practice of examining what the anger is actually telling you. The specific, curious, genuinely non-defensive practice of treating the anger as information rather than as instruction. The anger is always telling you something. Not always something accurate, not always something that the full recovered capacity would endorse, but always something. The anger is the nervous system's rapid assessment that something important has been threatened, violated, or disrespected. That something that matters to your values, to your sense of justice, to your understanding of how you deserve to be treated has been impacted in a way that the nervous system is registering as significant. This assessment is sometimes accurate. The anger at the genuine injustice, the anger at the genuine violation of a genuine value, the anger at the treatment that is genuinely disrespectful and that the genuine self-respect genuinely cannot endorse. These angers are the anger at its most useful, the specific, informative, genuinely relevant signal that something requires genuine attention. And the anger is sometimes inaccurate. The anger at the misinterpreted slight, the anger at the unintended tone, the anger at the person who did something that touched the specific, reliable, consistently findable tender spot without any knowledge that the tender spot existed. These angers are the anger at its most destructive, producing the same physiological and cognitive cascade in response to something that the full recovered capacity would not have assessed as significant. The examination, the specific, curious, genuinely non-defensive practice of asking what the anger is actually telling you, is the practice that distinguishes between these two categories. Not immediately, the examination cannot be conducted productively while the anger state is fully active, because the examination requires the prefrontal capacity that the anger state has impaired. But in the delay, in the space that the delay practice creates, what is this anger actually responding to? What specifically does the anger's assessment claim was threatened or violated or disrespected? Is that claim accurate? Is what the anger is claiming was violated actually violated? Was the thing that triggered the anger actually a genuine violation of a genuine value, or was it the interpretation of the trigger through the specific lens of the tender spot that the trigger accidentally pressed?
Marcus Aurelius practiced this examination with the specific, non-defensive, genuinely curious quality that characterizes his best philosophical work. When the anger arose, and he was honest about its arising, never claiming the complete absence of the anger response that the caricature of Stoic equanimity sometimes suggests, he would examine it, not as the self-punishing recognition that he should not be feeling angry, as the genuinely curious inquiry into what the anger was actually responding to, and whether the response was proportionate to the actual situation rather than to the amplified version of it that the anger state was presenting. The examination produced information. Sometimes the information confirmed that the anger was responding to something genuinely significant that genuinely required genuine attention. And sometimes the examination revealed that the anger was responding to something much smaller than the anger state was presenting, a misinterpretation, an unintended impact, a genuine but minor violation that the anger state was amplifying into something that warranted the full, costly, resource-consuming response that the anger was demanding. Examine what the anger is telling you, in the delay, with the specific, curious, non-defensive quality of someone who is more interested in the accurate picture than the confirming one, and let the examination produce the information that distinguishes the anger that deserves the genuine response from the anger that deserves the genuine release. The third pillar is the practice of perspective, the complete, specific, Stoic-grounded practice of seeing the anger-provoking situation from the perspective that the anger state consistently removes. The anger state is the state of maximum perspective narrowing, the physiological narrowing of cognitive focus, the specific measurable reduction of the field of attention to the immediate threatening high-priority stimulus removes from the field of view exactly the broader perspective that would most change the quality of the response. The broader perspective that the anger state removes includes at least 4 specific dimensions that are consistently highly relevant to the angry response to most anger-provoking situations. The first dimension is the other person's interiority. The anger state produces the specific, automatic, completely reliable assessment of the other person as the intentional perpetrator of the specific violation. They did this deliberately. They knew what they were doing. They specifically intended the impact it produced. This assessment, generated by the anger state, presented as the obvious reading of the situation, is often wrong. Often the person who produced the impact had no awareness of the specific tender territory that the impact landed in. Often they were acting from their own difficulty, their own limited information, their own unexamined patterns, rather than from the calculated intention that the anger state is claiming. The second dimension is the full relational context. The anger state removes the history of the relationship from the field of view, the specific accumulated evidence of who this person is across the full range of their relationship with you, and presents the single specific current violation as the defining characterization of the person. This is almost always the most misleading possible assessment of the relationship.
The person who has demonstrated consistent care and genuine goodwill across the history of the relationship is not most accurately characterized by the single moment in which they failed to meet the standard that the anger is holding them to. The third dimension is the long-term consequence of the angry response. The anger state presents the angry response as the obvious, immediately justified, and consequence-free option. The person deserves to be confronted. The situation deserves to be escalated. The anger deserves to be expressed. What the anger state does not present, because the prefrontal function that would present it is impaired, is the specific, realistic assessment of what the angry response will actually produce in the actual relationship over the actual time that follows the angry expression. The fourth dimension is the full context of the situation that produced the trigger. The anger state presents the trigger as the isolated, context-free violation of the specific norm that the anger is responding to. The broader perspective reveals the context, the specific, relevant circumstances, the pressures the other person was under, the information they had or did not have, the specific, human, completely understandable limitations that produce the behavior that the anger is presenting as the deliberate, inexcusable violation. Practice the perspective recovery. In the delay, through the specific, deliberate practice of asking the questions that restore the dimensions the anger state has removed. What is the other person's interiority? What is the full relational history? What will the angry response actually produce? What is the broader context that produced the trigger? These questions, asked genuinely, with the specific quality of someone who actually wants the accurate picture rather than the confirming one, produce the perspective that the angry response was consistently, reliably missing. The fourth pillar is the complete understanding and application of what the Stoics called the distinction between anger and strength. The specific, philosophically precise recognition that the anger that presents itself as the appropriate response to injustice is often neither the strongest nor the most effective response available. This is the specific misunderstanding about anger that is both most common and most costly. The belief that the angry response is the strong response. That the willingness to express anger is the evidence of the genuine care about the thing that the anger is claiming to be defending. That the restraint of the anger is the weakness of the person who does not care enough or who is not strong enough to express the care through the anger. This belief is wrong in the most practically consequential way possible, because it consistently produces the weaker response in the situations where the strongest response is most needed. The angry response is the response of the person whose physiology has taken over from their capacity. It is the response produced by the impaired prefrontal cortex rather than by the full capacity of the fully resourced person. And the response produced by the impaired capacity is, by definition, a weaker version of what the full capacity would produce. The strong response, in the Stoic sense, the genuinely most effective and most powerful response available, is the response produced by the full capacity.
The response that has had the time and the space and the cognitive resources to assess the situation accurately, to identify what the situation actually requires, to find the most effective available way of addressing what needs to be addressed, this response is produced not from the anger state, but from the state that the delay and the examination and the perspective recovery produce,
the state in which the full capacity is available and the full capacity is applied to the specific, honest, completely real assessment of the specific situation. Seneca was explicit about this. He said that the person who thinks that anger makes them stronger is mistaking the feeling of the anger for the effectiveness of the response. The anger feels like power, the specific rushing, energizing quality of the anger state, but the feeling is the physiological experience of the impaired capacity, not the experience of the full capacity. And the response produced from the feeling, whatever it is, however forceful it appears, is always a weaker response than the response that the full, unimpaired, completely recovered capacity would produce. Cato the Younger was the Stoic example that the ancient philosophical literature most consistently cited for this specific point. Cato was perhaps the most principled, most consistently justice-oriented, most relentlessly honest political figure in the late Republic. And he was also one of the most genuinely composed, not because he did not care about the injustices he was fighting, but because he understood that the composed, fully capacitated response to injustice was consistently more effective than the angry, impaired capacity response. When the political opponents of the Republic did something outrageous, and in the late Republic the outrageous was frequent and significant, Cato's response was not the angry explosion that the outrage was designed to produce. It was the specific, composed, fully capacitated, devastating precision of the response that only the full capacity can produce. And the precision of the response, built from the complete assessment of the situation, the complete identification of what the response needed to accomplish, the complete application of the full capacity to the production of the most effective available expression of the required response, was always, in the honest assessment, more powerful than any expression of the anger would have been. The strong response is the composed response, not the cold, indifferent, unreachable response. The warm, fully present, fully capacitated, completely genuine response of the person who has waited for the full capacity to return and has deployed the full capacity in the production of the most effective available response. Be strong by being composed, and discover that the composed response produced from the full capacity is consistently, reliably, measurably more powerful than the angry response produced from the impaired one.
The fifth pillar is the practice of identifying and addressing the specific recurring triggers that produce your most reliably destructive anger responses. The specific, honest, genuinely personal mapping of the territory where the anger is most likely to produce the most damage and where the preparation for the governed response is therefore most urgently needed. Every person has specific triggers, the specific types of situations that most reliably produce the most intense anger, the specific types of behavior that most consistently find the specific tender spots that the anger is organized around, the specific combinations of circumstances, the fatigue plus the small provocation that would not normally produce the significant anger, but that produces it reliably in the depleted state, that most predictably produce the most destructive anger responses. These triggers are not random. They are specific, personal, completely individual features of the specific person's specific emotional history. They are the specific places where the past, the specific experiences of violation or disrespect or injustice that the nervous system has not yet fully processed, is still organizing the present response. The trigger touches the old wound. The old wound activates the full anger response, and the full anger response is directed at the present person who has accidentally pressed the button of the old wound in a response that is calibrated to the old wound rather than to the actual present-day provocation. The mapping of the specific triggers is the specific, practical, completely honest practice of understanding the personal emotional geography, knowing where the old wounds are, knowing what presses them, knowing therefore where the anger is most likely to be most destructive, and where the specific preparation for the governed response is most urgently needed. Marcus Aurelius mapped his triggers in the private journals that constitute the Meditations, the specific types of people who most reliably pressed the specific reactions, the specific categories of behavior that most consistently produced the most difficult anger to govern. He named them, not as the performance of self-awareness, but as the practical, forward-looking practice of the person who understood that the mapped trigger is the trigger that can be prepared for, and the preparation, the specific,
deliberate, genuinely realistic mental rehearsal of the trigger's arrival and the governed response is the specific practice that makes the governed response most available in the actual moment when the trigger is encountered. Not because the rehearsal eliminates the anger state, but because the rehearsal has pre-built the template of the governed response, making it available at the moment when the anger state's impairment is reducing the real-time capacity to construct it from scratch. Map your triggers, specifically, honestly, without the defensive protection of the comfortable story that the anger is always proportionate and always externally produced. Know where the old wounds are, know what presses them, and prepare, specifically, daily, in the deliberate rehearsal of the governed response for the next encounter with the specific trigger in the specific context where the governed response is most needed and most difficult to produce without preparation.
The sixth pillar is the complete, practical, daily practice of the physical governance of the anger state. The specific, immediately available, physiologically effective practices that directly address the physiological dimensions of the anger cascade and that reduce the intensity of the state before the state has produced the irreversible action. The anger is physiological before it is cognitive. The cortisol and the adrenaline and the elevated heart rate and the impaired prefrontal function are all physiological events. And physiological events respond to physiological interventions in ways that cognitive interventions, the philosophical reasoning that tells the angry person to calm down, often cannot match in the immediate highest intensity moment of the anger state. The most immediately effective physiological intervention is the deliberate breath. Not the casual, unremarkable inhalation, but the specific, deliberate, physiologically informed breath that activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the system that is the antagonist of the fight-or-flight response, through the specific mechanism of the extended exhalation. The parasympathetic nervous system is activated preferentially by the exhalation phase of the breath cycle. The longer the exhalation relative to the inhalation, the more strongly the parasympathetic response is activated. And the parasympathetic response is the specific physiological mechanism through which the fight-or-flight state begins to wind down. The heart rate begins to decline. The cortisol and adrenaline metabolism accelerates. The muscle tension begins to release. And, most importantly, the prefrontal cortex begins to come back online. The breath is the fastest available physiological intervention for the anger state, not the complete resolution of the state, but the beginning of the recovery. The specific, immediately available, zero-cost, always accessible intervention that begins to restore the capacity that the anger state has impaired. Other physiological interventions are also available. The deliberate slowing of movement, the conscious, specific, completely real slowing of the physical behavior that the anger state accelerates, reduces the physiological intensity of the state. The deliberate posture adjustment, the specific, practiced quality of expanding the posture, breathing more fully, reducing the physical constriction that the anger state produces in the body, reduces the physiological feedback loop that the anger state's characteristic physical constriction reinforces. None of these is the complete treatment. All of them, applied in the moment of the anger state, before the irreversible action, produce the specific, physiologically real beginning of the recovery that the delay practice is designed to complete. And the recovery, even partial, even beginning, gives the delay practice the physiological ground it needs to do its work. Practice the breath in the ordinary moments so that the practice is available in the extraordinary ones. The specific, deliberate, physiologically informed breath that activates the parasympathetic response. The extended exhalation. The specific, practiced, completely real physical intervention that begins the recovery from the anger state before the anger state has produced the irreversible action.
The seventh pillar is the practice of genuine compassion as the antidote to anger. The specific, stoic, grounded, philosophically serious practice of genuinely considering what is happening in the other person that is producing the behavior that anger is responding to. This practice is not the performance of compassion for the audience that is watching. It is the genuine, honest, completely real attempt to understand, specifically from the inside of the other person's actual experience,
what is producing the behavior that has activated the anger. Not to excuse the behavior, not to pretend that the impact of the behavior is not real, but to understand it accurately, because the accurate understanding of the other person's behavior consistently changes the quality of the response to it. Marcus Aurelius began each day with the specific, deliberate practice of reminding himself that he would encounter difficult people who would do things that pressed the reactive patterns, who would behave in ways that the anger would respond to, and that these people were acting from their own limitations, their own unexamined patterns, their own difficulties and their own wounds, rather than from the calculated, deliberate, personally targeted violation that the anger state was claiming they were acting from. This reminder changed the quality of his encounters with the difficult people, not because the reminder made the difficult behavior acceptable, but because the accurate understanding of what was producing the difficult behavior made the anger a less natural and less urgent response to it. The person who is acting from their own limitation is not deserving of compassion in the sense of endorsement of the behavior, but they are deserving of the specific, honest, genuinely human recognition that they are struggling in ways that are producing impacts they may not be aware of, and that the governed, compassionate response to that specific combination is more likely to actually improve the situation than the angry response that the anger state was demanding. Practice genuine compassion, not as the comfortable, uncritical acceptance of all behavior, regardless of its impact, as the specific, honest, genuinely curious practice of trying to understand what is actually happening in the other person that is producing the behavior, and letting that understanding change the quality of the response from the anger that burns the responder first to the composed, genuinely capacitated response that actually addresses what needs to be addressed. The eighth pillar is the practice of the long view, the specific, Stoic, grounded practice of assessing the anger and the angry response from the perspective that includes the long-term consequence rather than only the immediate, high-intensity, present-moment dimension that the anger state is presenting. Dolabella's anger produced decisions that looked, in the immediate moment of the anger, like the obvious, justified, immediately necessary responses to the obvious, justified, immediately significant provocations. And each of them assessed from the perspective of the long-term consequence, the subordinate relieved, the bad alliance made, the reputation damaged in the specific way that the documented anger consistently damages, was the worst available response to the situation that had provoked it. The anger state has no long-term perspective.
It is a state evolved for the management of immediate physical threats. The threat is immediate. The response needs to be immediate. The long-term consequence of the response is not a relevant consideration in the assessment of an immediate physical threat. And so the anger state produces its response without the specific long-term perspective that every non-immediate threat situation requires for the genuinely effective response. The governed response, the response produced after the delay and the examination and the perspective recovery, includes the long-term consequence in the assessment. It asks not only what the immediate expression of the anger would produce, but what the long-term consequence of that expression would be. How the relationship would be affected, how the reputation would be affected, how the situation would develop in the weeks and months following the angry expression, how the person producing the expression would feel about the expression when assessed from the honest distance of the future. This long-term perspective, brought to the situation before the expression rather than after it, consistently produces the different and the better response. Because the long-term consequence of the angry expression is almost always significantly worse than the long-term consequence of the governed response to the same situation. And the governed response, produced with the long-term consequence in the assessment, is the response that is most likely to produce the outcome that the anger was actually trying to produce. Practice the long view, in the delay, specifically, honestly, with the genuine quality of someone who is actually considering the long-term consequence, rather than simply performing the consideration. And let the long view produce the response that the long view consistently, reliably produces. The governed, effective, actually address what needs addressing response, rather than the angry, impaired capacity, burn yourself first response that the anger state was demanding.
The ninth pillar is the complete, daily, Stoic grounded practice of building the inner equanimity that makes the anger less likely to arise in the first place, not through the suppression of the emotional response, but through the building of the interior quality from which the anger-triggering situations produce less intense and less destructive anger states. The anger management practices we have been discussing are all practices applied after the anger has arisen. They are the specific, important, immediately applicable interventions for the anger that has already activated the cascade. And they are genuinely important. The delay, the examination, the perspective recovery, the physiological intervention, the compassion practice, the long view, all of these are real and valuable and daily applicable. But the deepest, most complete, most genuinely Stoic approach to anger is not primarily the management of the anger after it has arisen. It is the building of the interior quality from which the anger-producing situations are assessed before the anger has time to arise. The specific, daily, genuinely built interior quality of equanimity, the settled, warm, genuinely unhurried interior quality of the person who has done the genuine work of the examined life, that produces a different and a better quality of first assessment of the anger-producing situation than the untrained interior produces.
The person with genuine equanimity does not feel the anger-triggering situation. They feel it, specifically, genuinely, with the honest quality of the person who's not performing imperviousness to what is genuinely impactful. But what they feel does not automatically produce the full anger cascade, because the interior quality from which the feeling is received is different from the interior quality from which the untrained person receives it. The equanimous interior produces the anger less automatically because it has done the specific, daily, genuine work of examining what genuinely matters and what does not. What genuinely deserves the full energy of the genuine response and what does not. What genuinely violates the genuine values and what merely presses the specific tender spots that the anger is organized around. And this examination, daily renewed, daily refined, genuinely practiced, produces the interior quality from which the anger-triggering situation is assessed with more accuracy and more genuine perspective than the untrained interior produces. Build equanimity. Through the daily practices of the examined life, the morning intention, the genuine examination, the perspective practice, the honest self-assessment, the patient complexity, the perspective taking, the philosophical humility, all of these, practiced daily, contribute to the building of the interior quality from which the anger-triggering situations produce less automatic and less destructive anger. Not because the situations are less provoking, because the interior that receives them is more genuinely equipped to receive them with the full, honest, completely real assessment of what they actually require, rather than the automatic, amplified anger state assessment of what the anger state is claiming they require. The 10th pillar is the practice of genuine repair. The complete, specific, Stoic grounded practice of addressing the damage that the unmanaged anger has already produced in the relationships and the situations and the reputations that have already paid the cost of the anger, that burn the self first and everything else second. Because anger does not only burn the person who is angry, it burns everyone in range. The relationship that received the angry expression, the specific person who was the target of the anger that was calibrated to the old wound rather than to their actual behavior, the reputation that was altered in the specific, visible, completely real way that the observed angry expression always alters reputation, the situation that was escalated rather than resolved by the angry response that the anger state produced. The repair is not the denial that the burning occurred. The honest repair begins with the honest acknowledgement, specific, non-defensive, genuinely held, that the anger produced an impact, and that the impact was real, and that the impact deserves to be honestly addressed, rather than managed with the comfortable story that the anger was entirely justified, and the impact was entirely the other person's responsibility. Seneca described the genuine repair with an honesty that makes clear he was writing from the experience of having done it, rather than from the theory of it.
The specific commitment, not as a general aspiration, but as a practical, concrete, actionable commitment to the different response in the next similar situation. This repair is important not only for the relationship that it repairs, it is important for the self, because the genuine acknowledgement of the anger's cost, the specific, honest, non-defensive acknowledgement that the anger burned not only the target, but the self, is the specific,
embodied, completely real learning from the specific, individual instance of unmanaged anger that makes the next instance less likely to be unmanaged. Repair genuinely, where the anger has produced the damage, with the specific, honest, non-defensive quality of the person who is more interested in the actual repair of the actual relationship than in the management of the impression that the repair is producing. The 11th pillar is the practice of the written dialogue with the anger, the specific, Stoic-grounded, practically transformative practice of writing about the anger in the delay, not as the performance of journal keeping, but as the practical, genuine engagement with the angry state that produces specific, useful information about what the anger is actually responding to, and what the wise response to the situation actually is. Writing produces a specific cognitive quality that speaking and thinking alone cannot produce. The writing requires the specific translation of the internal state into language, and the translation consistently reveals dimensions of the internal state that the non-translated experience does not reveal. What seemed in the non-written experience, like the unified, clear, obvious anger at the obvious, clear, justified provocation, reveals itself in the translation as a more complex, more multidimensional, more personally specific experience than the immediate anger state presented. The angry writing begins as the expression of the anger, the specific, uncensored, completely genuine expression of what the anger is feeling and why, and what the anger is claiming about the situation and the person who produced it. This expression, written, reveals the specific content of the angry assessment in a form that can then be examined. And the examination, the specific second phase practice of reading what the anger wrote and asking, with the genuine quality of someone who is now in the delay rather than in the height of the anger state, what is actually accurate in what the anger is claiming, produces the specific, genuine, practically useful information about the situation that the pure anger state cannot produce. Marcus Aurelius did this in the Meditations, not always in the most dramatic entries. The dramatic entries are the ones that the readers find most quotable, but in the entries where the specific, personal, completely real anger at the specific, personal, completely real behavior of specific, identifiable people in his life is honestly written and then honestly examined. The writing was the anger's expression. The examination was the governing mind's engagement with the expression. And the combination, the expression followed by the examination, produced the specific, practical, completely genuine assessment of what the situation actually required.
Write the anger, in the delay, specifically, honestly, without the censorship that makes the writing comfortable but less useful. And then read what you wrote, in the delay, with the recovering capacity that the delay has made available. And let the reading of what the anger wrote be the specific, practical, completely real examination that produces the wise response to what the anger was responding to. The 12th pillar is the practice of what might be called the anger audit. The specific, regular, completely honest practice of reviewing the patterns of your anger over time to identify the specific, recurring, genuinely personal features of your anger history that most need the specific attention of the specific, targeted practices we have been discussing. The anger audit is not the self-punishment of the person who is reviewing their worst moments. It is the specific, practical, completely useful practice of the person who is reviewing the patterns, not the individual instances, the overall patterns, to identify where the anger is most costly, most frequent, most clearly connected to the specific, recurring, relational contexts that the honest overview consistently reveals. The patterns reveal things that the individual instances do not. The individual instance of anger can always be explained by the specific situational provocation that the specific individual instance was responding to. The pattern cannot be explained in this way. The pattern reveals something about the interior rather than about the exterior, about the specific, recurring, genuinely personal features of the emotional geography that the individual instances are expressing.
Seneca returned to this practice throughout his life's writing on anger, the honest review of the patterns, the specific acknowledgement of what the patterns revealed about the specific, personal, genuinely individual features of his own relationship with anger, the specific targeted application of the specific practices to the specific patterns that the honest overview identified as most needing the attention. Conduct the anger audit regularly, with the honest, non-defensive quality of the person who is more interested in the accurate picture of the patterns than in the comfortable story that explains each individual instance as entirely justified and entirely situationally produced. And let the honest picture of the patterns be the specific, practical, completely useful guide to where the specific targeted practice of the specific pillar is most urgently needed. The 13th and final pillar is the complete integration, the daily, living, breathing, genuinely practiced expression of all the preceding pillars as a single, coherent, completely real way of inhabiting the relationship with anger that the genuinely examined life produces. Because here is the deepest truth about anger that the Stoics arrived at through genuine practice, and that Seneca documented across the full arc of his extraordinary philosophical work on the subject, and that every person who has genuinely done the work of governing anger has eventually confirmed. Anger burns you first. Always, without exception, in every instance, regardless of the justification for the anger and regardless of the severity of the provocation.
The anger begins its burning in the interior of the person who experiences it, in the physiology, in the cognitive impairment, in the relational damage, in the character erosion, before it has produced a single degree of the externally directed impact it is claiming to be aimed at. And the governed response, the response produced from the delay, the examination, the perspective recovery, the physiological intervention, the compassion, the long view, the equanimity, is not the weaker response, it is the stronger one. The more genuinely capacitated, the more accurately assessed, the more effectively targeted, the more genuinely powerful response. The response that the full capacity produces when the full capacity is given the time and the space and the governed interior that the full capacity requires. Dolabella's anger was faster than his intelligence, and the gap, the specific consequential gap between the anger's speed and the intelligence's engagement, was the territory in which every decision he ever regretted was made. Close the gap. Through the daily, specific, completely real practice of all the pillars, through the delay that creates the space, through the examination that uses the space, through the perspective recovery that fills the space with the accurate picture, through the physiological intervention that restores the capacity the space requires, through the compassion that changes the quality of the assessment, through the long view that assesses the consequence, through the equanimity that reduces the frequency and the intensity of the anger that requires the space in the first place, through the repair that addresses the damage the anger has already produced, through the written dialogue that produces the information the examination needs, through the audit that identifies the patterns the targeted practice needs to address. All of it, daily, in the ordinary moments, building the gap that Dolabella never built, the specific, deliberate, completely real space between the anger's arrival and the intelligence's engagement that is the only territory in which the wise response is ever actually produced. Anger burns you first, always. The only question is whether the burning produces the governed, effective, genuinely powerful response or the impaired, destructive, self-consuming one. The gap makes the difference. Build it. Every day, in every available moment.
Subscribe to the Stoic Mindset right now, because this channel is where the complete, honest, philosophically grounded, practically applicable practice of governing anger, not suppressing it, not performing the composure over the top of the burning interior, but genuinely, daily, through the specific Stoic practices that actually address the actual mechanism of the actual anger state, is developed week after week, with the full depth and the full honesty and the full practical weight that the subject actually deserves. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the bell notification so that every new lesson reaches you the moment it is released. Every week on this channel, we go all the way into the ancient wisdom that produced Cato and Marcus Aurelius and Seneca himself. People who were not composed because they did not feel the anger, but because they had done the specific, daily, genuinely unglamorous work of building the governed interior from which the anger's presence did not automatically produce the anger's destructive expression. The people who find this channel and stay are the people who have understood what Seneca understood, that the anger burns the angry person first, always, and that the governed response is not the weaker option, but the stronger one, produced from the full capacity rather than the impaired one. Who have decided that the gap between the anger's arrival and the intelligence's engagement is the most important gap they will ever build. Subscribe right now. Share this with someone whose anger is burning them more than they realize. Come back for the next lesson, because what we are doing here together is the most important practice available. Building the interior quality from which the anger that burns you first is met by the governed, fully capacitated, genuinely powerful response that addresses what needs addressing without consuming what needs protecting. Subscribe now.